So my guess is that we're out to ask you for a memorable Bible verse. Probably few would come from First Peter, and I'd be willing to bet maybe none would come from Second Peter. As early as the 4th century, there were early church fathers, one of them Eusebius, who was using words like anti-legomena to describe these books of the Bible that were somewhat questionable. It was questionable who wrote the book, even though they might be given the name of somebody. And it was also questionable as to how valuable they were as instruction or for instruction. Eusebius thought that 2 Peter, not 1 Peter like we're talking about today, but the next book, 2 Peter, was part of that antilegomena, right? And as late as the 15th century, questions still remained about some of the books. Our greatest hero, right, for the Reformed faith, Martin Luther, he had some questions about some books. Particularly, we always hear about Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. And none of these books helped his case for grace alone or faith alone. There was something different in the spirit of these books than those other books of the New Testament. And so he was ready to just toss them. And I think the story goes as he sort of wanted them to be thrown out, but the other folks of the movement said, hey, don't be throwing out any books. So when he translated his German translation, he just kind of stuck them in as sort of an index. So while I'm not at all surprised that Luther didn't take issue with 1 Peter, it is a bit puzzling to me, though, that he didn't want to toss out 2 Peter. Why? Because, well, when I read 2 Peter and I read James and Jude and do a little bit of the legwork historically, there's a shared spirit there between 2 Peter and James and Jude especially. So why talk about 2 Peter when we are reading and thinking about 1 Peter today? Well, it's not likely, we need to sort of get our brains around this, it's not likely that we are reading the actual words of Simon Peter, as if Simon Peter sat down and wrote a letter, and now we have this primary source from the hand of a man who sat at the feet of Jesus. Highly unlikely. But whether Peter wrote the letter or not, it is worth sort of driving our spade into that holy ground and turning over to earth and see kind of what's there. Where is the meaning made here underneath a book like 1 Peter? 1 Peter, I think if we'll do this, if we'll use our brains a little bit and our hearts, we will see that 1 Peter speaks a particular kind of word to you and to me today as people who are, what week is this now? Sitting at home, not quarantined, but sheltered in place on whatever day this is of this COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll talk about a little bit about that later, but I got to do sort of the boring stuff and get you up to speed so that I can finally make that point. So hang on, buckle in. So the books questioned by Eusebius and Martin Luther, they have this common theme. See, you will hear them somewhere in there. Now, if you're talking about James, I think his whole book is just sort of an attack on a false teacher. But these other books will actually mention there's false teachers. So think about it a little bit. If you do the work, you'll find out we're not talking so much about false teachers, but it really begins to narrow down to a false teacher, singular, right? As a matter of fact, just to make it easier, spoiler alert, it's more likely that they are talking about Saul of Tarsus, our beloved Paul. Now, the New Testament alone sort of gives us, if we look across the books, Who is Paul? Do a quick read on all the different angles on Paul. We can learn some things. First, Paul received a Greek education in rhetoric. Like who? Like most Roman citizens would have gotten, right? And not just everyday Roman citizens, but Roman aristocrats. So people pretty high up in the Roman echelon or whatever. Paul was related to the family of Herods, and something that you miss it if you don't do some digging around, but it's there. At the end of one of his letters, he says, I'd like to greet my relative, Herodion. All right, clearly an historic Herodian, and he's kin to him. So he is related to the family of the Herods. He was trained as a Pharisee, he says, and that makes sense because the Herods and the Pharisees were in cahoots at the time. And then we see that Paul has an audience with Herod Agrippa and also Herod Agrippa's sister, Bernice. Now, who are these people? Well, you got to do some digging to find out. I don't have time to get into it here, but Bernice would wind up as Titus Flavius's mistress. Who is Titus Flavius? He's the dude who conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, son of Vespasian, and who would eventually become emperor of Rome. And he has got an ear with Bernice, this very wealthy woman who was passed along to many wealthy men if you read in the history books. All right, so when Paul was arrested, we see that Paul is given sort of this protection of 400 soldiers and officials to make sure nothing happens to him in his travels. So see, Paul is not this little itinerant old country preacher out there just trying to do good and just a simple man preaching the gospel. No, that's not the picture we get when we do the work. He is actually deemed an infiltrator and a false teacher by these people or these communities that would be behind the spirit of this James and Jude and 2 Peter type letters. So Paul's prestige and his connection to Rome would have been absolutely detestable to those zealous for the old law. Yet, in some ways, absolutely, Paul is the most influential voice that we have in our New Testament. So for Eusebius and for Martin Luther, Paul is the absolute standard. He is the one whose theology all other theologies are weighed against. All other books, whether or not they're going to be sort of really acceptable or just pseudo books, is do they match this theology of Paul? And the church, we can see, was never quite comfortable with this tension that is right there in our sacred books, right? We have these letters of James and Jude and 2 Peter, and then we have letters like 1 Peter that we're reading today, and letters from Paul, and these are two competing theologies. Now, I'm not in any way saying that Paul's teaching is false, nor am I saying or promoting the spirit, this zealot spirit behind the books of like James and Jude and 2 Peter. But I think it's important that we realize that the church was always okay with 1 Peter, but when it came to 2 Peter, not so much. Remember, 2 Peter was included in Eusebius's Antilegomena. So 2 Peter reflects the spirit of those letters in question. 1 Peter that we're reading today absolutely reflects and even looks like and is structured like, suspiciously, a letter from Paul. So how do we distinguish between these two theologies? Mike, you've told us we have two theologies. Can you sort of explain that? Probably not, but I'll try. So for James and 2 Peter and Jude, judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. And God is ready to bring fire upon the earth and to cleanse it of everyone not working toward righteousness according to the law. Let me just put that in a phrase. works righteousness. Absolutely. What does James say? Show me your faith, I'll show you my works. Paul, his writing often contends with this way of thinking. If you dig around and you look, if you can maneuver through some of the fluff in Acts, and you can find, especially towards the latter part of the book, you can see where Paul is wrestling with this church. It's under James, and the spirit of how they're trying to make sure everybody's righteous according to food laws, and righteous according to circumcision, and righteous according to taking oaths and that sort of thing. And then you see the same thing also in Paul's letters, Galatians and 1 Corinthians, maybe Thessalonians. But anyways, so we get that in there. And then so in Paul's letters and in Acts, the early church under James, the brother of the Lord, and his associate Peter, see, they exhibit this same spirit of these other letters, these questionable letters that we're talking about. This is a spirit that is made all the more vigorous by the encroaching Romans. So 1 Peter is going to be very much like Paul's letter to the Romans. It's going to encourage people to fear God and honor the emperor. It even goes so far to say at one point, as if those two were in some way connected. Now, if you were to walk up to James or to Peter or to one of these communities of these letters we're talking about and say, oh, and by the way, fear God and honor the emperor, you would be murdered and you would incite a riot. And anyone that defiled the righteousness of the old law way, and especially a profane Herodian like Paul, apparently, would be in God's crosshairs on the day of the Lord to these people. Better to just rid God's people of such a person before they poison the water and delay this coming of the day of the Lord, when the angels, the heavenly host, would come down and defeat the enemy, right? People like Paul running around with their false teachings is going to, in some way, usurp that expectation. And that's just the kind of thing that we see from these primitive zealot Christians on that day when they attempted to do Paul in. And you can read about it in Acts 21 and 22, I think. So in these two pseudonymous letters, we have competing theologies. 1 Peter, what we're reading today, I think is more in line with Paul. 2 Peter is going to be a little more in line with these letters that the church always questioned. These competing theologies, they're going to give us insights into the way people of faith wrestled with that contradiction of the world that they observed and the world that they believed in. In other words, that's, if we back off and look down upon this, we are watching the way two certain theologies of how do you handle when the world that you're looking at with your eyes doesn't match the world that you know is true in your heart. And these two theologies are two ways to handle that. You can see now where this is starting to matter to us. The church favored compromise between church and empire for peaceful coexistence through Paul's heavenly Christ, right? That's always been the path of least resistance in church history. The other theology of earthly righteousness at all cost in order to expedite the day of the Lord and to punish all unrighteousness, those folks were completely eradicated by Rome during the Jewish wars, particularly by whom? Titus Flavius and his army, when he was serving as commander of his dad's army, Vespasian's army. And he went in, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. These communities fled to the hills and eventually were snuffed out completely. So to them, to that attitude, to those people of that slant, Christ's resurrection was fuel to fight. Christ's resurrection was proof that God would resurrect them up after they were killed if they died valiantly in battle trying to to be righteous and to keep God's law. Die for the law, and you will be raised from the dead, just like Christ. And you'll come back to earth as conquerors. So you see the difference between these two theologies. Now, maybe we feel restless at the thought of the world that we observe and the world that we believe in. Because especially right now, the two don't seem to match up. At some point, part of us gets impatient. Part of us wants what we want and what we think that we deserve, and eventually we'll go after it, even if it costs lives. We begin to tell ourselves stories about how others are to blame for our situation. The idea of true righteousness takes on the form of, we got to get out and do something about this right now. 1 Peter feels like an attempt to calm those emotions, to relax people a little bit. Bloodshed, or for us, virus spread, isn't going to help anyone, according to this 1 Peter theology. According to this letter, we have, as it says, new birth as God's children, so that we have a sure hope and the promise of an inheritance that can never be spoiled or soiled and never fade away. The call here is specifically for faith instead of works, for trusting God instead of for striving so hard to bring to pass what we think should happen. We are Easter people. This is the second Sunday of Easter. We are Easter people. We are believing people. And right now, our faith, I think, is being tested. We are probably in the worst part of it right now. And what I mean by worst part of it, I kind of said that in my email letter to you. We were building up to Easter. Easter came and went. It was anticlimactical. And now what? More waiting. More waiting. And soon there's going to be states that maybe will be released from the bondage of this pandemic, while states like ours, aren't due to peak for another month or however long it is. So if staying at home is the right thing to do, it'll be a trying time to watch others able to roam free and to get back to some sense of normal while we are still staying at home. And it's especially tough, I think, and emotions will begin to fester as we watch business accounts bled dry and as we see whole industries seem to crumble before our eyes with nothing we can do about it but just watch the implosion. Our passage calls it being plagued by all sorts of trials. The faith expressed in 1 Peter, that faith calms us. It calms us during trials like these, even if we are sheltered in place. Still without seeing him, our passage tells us, you are already filled with a joy so glorious it cannot be described. Why? Because you believe. Faith. On the second Sunday of Easter, yes, another Sunday home, another video, against anything in us that wants to melt down, to break out, or to eventually endanger ourselves and others, let your believing, your certainty of God's purpose at each moment, let that bring to mind that tried and true joy that 1 Peter is talking about. Joy so glorious, it cannot be described. And I would add, even while sheltering in place. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.